Good day. Today is Saturday, 20th September 2025. I am still in Chicago, but I will be flying back to London today. It is a fairly long flight, so I will be actually back in terms of timing in British time in London on Sunday morning, but I shall be able to do my program. I anticipate I'll be able to do my program tomorrow, and I hope that it will be appearing at roughly the usual time. This program I'm making in the short time before I leave for my flight. So again, apologies, but it is going to have to be shorter than most of the programs that I do. And in some ways this is unfortunate because there is an awful lot currently going on. More political and diplomatic maneuvers in relation to the Ukrainian conflict, and also now an intensification of diplomacy in advance of what I am confident will be a strike before very long, another strike before very long on Iran. But let's discuss quickly and first the situation, the diplomacy concerning Ukraine. I'm going to say diplomacy, but it's not exactly diplomacy as such, because the incident that has attracted the most attention is an incident which supposedly took place yesterday when 3 Russian MiG-31 fighter jets crossed the Baltic Sea, traveling from Karelia in Russia to the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, and according to the Estonians, spent 12 minutes, a total of 12 minutes, inside Estonian airspace. And the Estonians are loudly complaining that this was a deliberate infringement of their airspace by the Russians, and that this was another aggressive step taken by the Russians just a week after the drone incursion into Poland and a further alleged drone incursion into Romania. And they are also again asking for consultations with the other NATO states under Article 4, and they're also demanding further action. Some other Baltic states appear to be going even further in complaining about what has taken place than Estonia itself is. One of these is Lithuania, whose foreign minister is saying that Estonia should have shot the MiG-31s down. I'm not sure how that is achieved. I wasn't aware that Estonia had an air force. And MiG-31s, as anybody knows who is familiar with military aircraft, are 3 of the most powerful and advanced fighter jets in the world. I doubt that Estonia has that capability. I doubt very much that Lithuania has that capability. However, a Swedish minister, and I suspect Sweden absolutely does have a capability to shoot down fighter jets, though whether that capability would extend to shooting down 3 MiG-31s in this kind of operation. Anyway, a Swedish minister has also made the same demand. Now, I'm going to make a brief preliminary observation of my own here. Firstly, it is correct to say that this comes a few days after, about a week after, the alleged drone incursion into Poland by the unarmed decoy reconnaissance drones. We have had no clarification of that incident. The Russian offer for consultations with Poland to discuss and examine what happened and to see whether a consensus view could be achieved, well, that offer has been summarily rejected by the Poles. There's been an awful lot of angry rhetoric from Poland. There's even some discussion or some talk in Poland of Poland actually initiating research into the military uses of nuclear power. You can draw your own conclusions. Anyway, that incident has come and gone. Then there was another incident of another alleged incursion, this time by a Russian drone, supposedly over Romanian airspace. That particular drone was not shot down, at least not that I know of. I've not actually seen any proof other than the Romanian statements that this drone even existed, or that it was a Russian drone, if it did. Anyway, I just say that. Anyway, we've had that further incident of the drone, the Russian drone, which is supposed to have entered Romanian airspace. And now we have seen this latest incident with these MiG-31 fighter jets, these complaints, to be specific, from Estonia, which are far more vocal, and they've come, of course, with photographs which show the MiG-31s flying in the sky. Of course, the sky looks the same everywhere, so that in itself doesn't tell us very much about the location of these fighter jets, but there is no doubt that these fighter jets did indeed cross the Baltic, and probably they did at least approach Estonia. Now, it has been said that what probably happened, and let me stress again, I have no information other than what appears in the Western media and what Western governments are saying. It has been alleged that if these fighter jets did travel through any part of Estonian airspace, this was close to an island called Vaino. It's actually uninhabited and is apparently merely a rock, and it is in the Baltic Sea, and it is said to be some 25 to 30 kilometers north of the Estonian coast. So it may be that this was a navigation error by the Russian aircraft, but I should say that the Russians themselves, the Russian Defense Ministry, has now published a statement in which it categorically denies that these fighter jets actually crossed into any part of Estonian airspace at all. Well, of course, some people in the West continue to tell a different story. I've even read claims that the MiG-31s travelled over Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, which is, of course, absolute nonsense. It doesn't seem that they crossed Estonian land at all. They might have been close to this island. I don't know. One way or the other. They might have crossed into Estonian airspace. Again, I don't know. One way or the other. Apparently, things like that do happen. They are not that rare. Unsurprisingly, normally there would be a protest and a complaint, and that would be the end of the matter. For the record, I am more inclined on this one to go with what the Russians are saying. I think that probably the Russians are right, and that these fighter jets did not go close to this island. What I suspect is happening is that some people in the Baltic area, in NATO, are very unhappy that the United States, that President Trump, did not take the drone incident over Poland seriously, and they are looking for excuses to escalate the situation further. And of course, there was the incident with the drone that supposedly crossed into Romanian airspace, but that hardly grabbed Donald Trump's attention. So why not present him with a story of MiG-31 fighter jets, Russian MiG-31 fighter jets crossing into Estonian airspace, terrifying this small, weak country, the aggressive Russian bear, back in action. The narrative, the story almost writes itself. And it is so neat that, as I said, it makes me very suspicious. Anyway, that is my own view about this. Donald Trump has simply said that he's not happy about this incident at all, and he seems to have left it at that. So if this is an attempt, again, to engage Donald Trump, to make him start taking more aggressive steps with respect to Russia, more forceful steps with respect to Russia, well, for the moment, that attempt appears to be unsuccessful. Now, it could be that there is another issue that perhaps lies at the base of this story. And that is, of course, that MiG-31 fighter jets are aircraft. One normally seeks to shoot down fighter jets, either with other fighter jets or with air defense missiles. It has been well understood for some time that there is now a critical shortage of air defense missiles in Ukraine, and to anticipate, the Russians last night conducted another massive missile and drone strike across Ukraine. And though the Ukrainians claimed that they shot down most of the drones, something like 500 out of the 600 drones launched, and most of the missiles, 30 out of 40, I don't think anybody any longer who tracks what is going on over the course of these strikes believes those claims anymore. On the contrary, it looks to me as if the great proportion of the drones and, of course, also of the missiles actually did hit their targets. Just saying. So, there is a shortage of air defense missiles, and this is probably one of the reasons Ukraine is increasingly failing to shoot down drones and especially incoming Russian missiles. And as the incident in Poland a week ago demonstrated, the air defenses in Eastern Europe, in Poland, are very poor, and the Poles struggled, despite help from NATO, even to shoot down the drones. So reports that the United States is now stopping completely supplies of Patriot missile interceptors to Europe, including Patriot missile interceptors ultimately destined for Ukraine, inevitably is provoking alarm. Now, this is what has just been claimed in the American media. I believe it was Axios. I might be wrong. But anyway, it does look as if the United States has again come back to the decision that it is no longer supplying Patriot missile interceptors to Europe, either for the Europeans themselves or for the Europeans to supply to Ukraine. And this, I am sure, has caused a shiver of alarm across Europe. And of course, it brings us back to the position that we were in, I believe it was in June or July, when there were missile and drone strikes by the Russians on Kiev. And there was lots of complaints that the Americans weren't helping and weren't putting enough pressure on the Russians about that. And then reports appeared then that the Pentagon was halting supplies of Patriot missile interceptors to Ukraine. And then President Trump had a series of telephone calls with Zelensky and Friedrich Merz of Germany, and he agreed to supply more Patriot missile interceptors to finish an outstanding delivery of Patriot missile and interceptors which had been held up. And there was much talk about more Patriot missile interceptors and indeed complete Patriot missile systems being sent to Ukraine. And the blame, quite wrongly by the way, was placed on Elbridge Colby in the Pentagon. He was supposedly the person who had stopped the supply of the Patriot missile interceptors. and Donald Trump, the president, denied that he'd had any knowledge or had been previously told that Patriot missile interceptors were no longer being supplied to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians, a claim which I don't believe. Anyway, all of that happened, as I remember, in the early or mid-summer. And we are back, it seems, there again, only this time it looks as if it is final. I say that, of course, the Americans can sometimes reverse themselves as they did in the summer, but I understand that the Americans this time have been communicating more clearly and definitively their refusal to the Europeans. They are not in a position to supply Patriot missile interceptors to the Europeans or complete Patriot systems, launchers and radars and all of that to the Europeans or to the Ukrainians anymore. And this has apparently triggered shockwaves across Europe because the Europeans have been continuing to supply air defense missiles, including the Patriot missiles that the Ukrainians were demanding and which they had. They've been continuing to supply the Ukrainians with those missiles out of their own stockpiles, assuming that the Americans would replace them. And now the Americans are not going to replace them, and apparently there is a state of alarm and shock about this. Well, there shouldn't be. When this incident, this whole business started back a few months ago, I made the point that Donald Trump and Elbridge Colby and Pete Hegseth and all of these people are not in a position to magic Patriot missile interceptors out of thin air. There is only a finite number of Patriot missile interceptors in the US military inventory, and the manufacturer, Raytheon, is only able to produce them at the rate of perhaps 600 a year. So it is simply not possible for the United States to satisfy Ukraine's demands for Patriot missile interceptors, which are huge. The logistics, the industrial realities make that impossible. And the Europeans apparently simply refuse to see this. They imagine instead that this is all some kind of malevolent plan by Elbridge Colby to focus instead on China. But again, I'm going to suggest here that the Europeans are being unreal, delusional. What they appear to be demanding is that the United States should go on supplying air defense missiles to Ukraine at whatever rate Ukraine and Europe demand, up to the point where the United States itself has no air defense missiles left. This is absurd. It is ridiculous. It again shows the incredible sense of entitlement, the extraordinary degree to which the Europeans and the Ukrainians are focused on one overriding thing, which is the war with Russia in Ukraine. Anyway, I suspect that this is partly the issue here, because the Americans are not keen to be dragged back into a situation where they're having to take responsibility for defending the Baltic and Eastern Europe and, of course, Ukraine from perfectly normal Russian military flights. And they have said that they are not prepared to supply more Patriot missiles. Apparently, some of the European countries are now feverishly looking for alternatives. Denmark is said to have placed a huge order for the SAP ASPEED system from France and Italy. The trouble with that system is that the production rates there are tiny even by comparison with the Patriot systems that the United States produces. I'm not going to even compare with Russian production volumes, which are, of course, on a completely different scale again. It will be long years, I suspect, before the Danes see their airspeed missiles. And those missiles are not going to be produced in anything like the quantities that are needed to make up the differences in terms of this ongoing conflict that is taking place now in Ukraine. Now, I should say that every day I'm reading of more problems with European industry. There's an article today in the Financial Times. There were supposed to be plans to develop a new fifth generation fighter jet in Europe. There's already one program which supposedly brings Britain and Japan and I believe South Korea together. I don't know where that is going. But the Germans and the French were supposed to be working on such a program, except, of course, that the Germans and the French could not agree on who the leader in the program would be. The French, I think entirely understandably, said it should be them. After all, they are the only significant European country, apart from Sweden, that actually produces fighter jets, and who knows a little, therefore, about how to produce fighter jets. But that was unacceptable to the Germans. There's the usual arguments and disputes about the nature of the fighter jet that is to be created. And anyway, this entire program is now in peril because the Germans and the French cannot agree. And apparently the Germans are now looking for an alternative partner. And the talk is they're looking to Britain, except, of course, Britain is already committed to that other program with Japan. So one gets the sense of the scale of the procurement crisis that exists in Europe. So in this situation, why not play up stories of drones and incursions and produce pictures of MiG-31 fighter jets crossing over NATO territory and tell the Americans, look, you're talking about China, you're worried about yourselves, but ultimately this is where the real threat is. The bear is on the prowl, it's on the move. We've got to have you back, because if you don't come back, then definitely they will come for us, and then where will you be? And it must be said that there are some American officials who go along with that narrative. General Kellogg has just given an interview to the Daily Telegraph, very interesting interview, in which he repeats all the same things that he's been saying many times and still seems blissfully confident that eventually, through sanctions, the Russians, Putin, as he put it, will be brought to heel. Anyway, Kellogg, who has previously told us that the Russians are losing the war, has now also says that if the Russians were to win the war, by which he means if they were to conquer the whole of Ukraine, then obviously, inevitably, inexorably, they would be on the move again before very long. They would come for someone else. And again, this narrative is being constantly spun. It comes up against almost no pushback that I can see, other than for a few brave, isolated voices. But nobody ever explains the rationale for this. I mean, why would the Russians want to move west? Why would they want to take on Poland and Finland and Germany and France? What benefit accrues to them from doing anything like that? France and Britain, as General Kellogg himself reminded us, have nuclear weapons. So attacking those countries anyway comes with a certain risk. But Russian aggressiveness is taken for granted It's assumed that the Russians are aggressive and revanchist, that they want to rebuild the Soviet Union or revive the Russian Empire or conquer Europe. So we must respond, and the Americans must respond. And if they're telling us that they don't have air defense missiles, well, too bad. They must give us whatever they have, everything they have, and come over here to defend us as well. And, well, another person who, of course, is singing the same story is President Zelensky of Ukraine. He is clearly a frustrated and, I would say, worried man. Now, I say that he's given a big interview in his office in Kiev to the Western media. I wasn't there, so I haven't seen him. I don't know whether footage of this exists. But anyway, basically, he spoke of his intense frustration, his great anger about the fact that President Trump has now linked sanctions, American sanctions against Russia, to European sanctions against Russia. He is angry, so far as I could tell, with both the Europeans and the Americans because they're taking so much time. He says Ukraine can't wait. It needs all its help now. It needs the sanctions to be imposed on Russia immediately. He repeated that he's prepared to meet with Putin, but he didn't give any indication that he wants to negotiate on any of the substantive issues. For the record, in the same interview that he gave, General Kellogg also said that he disagrees with Trump about the ceasefire idea, even though this was something that Trump and Putin agreed with each other in Alaska, that there would not be a ceasefire. Kellogg continues to want a ceasefire. He continues to insist that a freeze of the conflict with indefinite negotiations going nowhere is the way forward. He says that the Ukrainians need to understand that they're not going to be able to recapture their own territories, their old territories, but of course, if there's a freeze, they will get them back one day. General Kellogg still seems to cling to the tattered remnants of his original plan. And, well, President Zelensky, for his part, he's come round very grudgingly to the idea of a freeze, but he's infuriated that the Russians haven't, and he's not prepared to make any further concessions. And, well, he still wants the Americans and the Europeans and the others to move forward to impose extreme economic pressure on the Russians, again, paying no attention to any effect that this might have on their own economies. Zelensky never talks about that. He never recognizes that the sanctions that have already been imposed already have exacted an immense cost for the Europeans. He never seems to show any concern, let alone gratitude about that. Anyway, he continues to demand more, and he expresses again his deep frustration and anger that this process is not moving forward fast enough. And he says that when the General Assembly session in New York, the UN General Assembly session in New York takes place next week, he will be there, and he expects to meet Donald Trump there, and he's going to bring all of that up with Donald Trump, and he's going to try to get Trump to move forward with the massive tariffs and sanctions and other things against the Russians. So when I said at the outset of the program that there's been a fair amount of diplomatic action, I was actually wrong. There's been no diplomatic action at all. There's been theatre and performance. There's been pictures of MiG-31 fighter jets. There's been interviews by General Kellogg. There have been threatening statements from the Swedes, a Swedish minister, and the Lithuanians and the Estonians, this demanding harsh action against the Russians. There's anger and frustration on Zelensky's part, anger and frustration undoubtedly intensified by the increasingly bad news from the battlefronts. By the way, he also, on that topic, bragged about his drone attacks deep into Russia. But from the excerpts of his interviews that I have read, I cannot find any reference to missile strikes on Russia. Maybe the big Russian drone and missile strikes on Ukraine have killed those plans, at least for the moment, as I speculated in a recent program. Anyway, so there's been no diplomatic action. The only actual concrete action which has been taken is that the United States has made the decision it was inevitably at some point going to have to make, which is to prioritize the rebuilding of its own inventories of air defense missiles over the needs of Ukraine and the obsessions of its European partners. Now, alongside all of that, it's become increasingly clear also that the Europeans, at least, are now pushing increasingly forward with various plans to seize the Russian assets. Ursula von der Leyen has now proposed 2 schemes to do this. We've discussed these in a program on the Duran. Basically, both of these schemes are just that. They are schemes, as I have already explained many times. If you do something illegal and then engage in a scheme to cover what you're doing up, then that does not make what you are doing any less illegal. It merely proves that you knew it was illegal when you did it. It's a fact, a simple point that Western leaders don't seem to understand. Anyway, there is constant traffic and communication between the hardliners in Europe and the hardliners in the US Senate. And surprise, surprise, now they're coming up with similar proposals for seizing Russian assets, this time in the United States, where there are far fewer of them, presumably in order to mirror and support the various plans that the Europeans are doing. Now, I am not going to unpack these plans, at least not in these videos. I mean, basically, what they seem to amount to is creating some kind of bond or loan equal or roughly equal to the size of the Russian assets, which will then be sent to Ukraine as a kind of advanced reparations loan. This is apparently the rhetoric that is being used. And the idea is that when the day comes, when the Russians capitulate and agree to pay the reparations, the Europeans will be paid back out of the assets in the form of reparations payments. I mean, it's absurd. It's basically giving money to the Ukrainians, Russian money to the Ukrainians, pretending that it isn't Russian money, but at the same time creating a bond to guarantee, to protect yourself from the consequences, which, if things go wrong, will fall to European taxpayers to pay. Anyway, I'm not going to, as I said, unpack it. You can watch our program on the Duran where we discuss this whole enterprise in detail. But over the course of that program and earlier programs, my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, made what I think is an entirely valid point, which is that you will know the moment when the sanctions weapon has exhausted itself, because that will be the moment when the Europeans finally decide to put all legal doubts and qualms to one side and straightforwardly seize the Russian assets. I say straightforwardly. Of course, they're not doing it straightforwardly. They're doing it in this convoluted way. So that, I think, is where we are. And all of these various moves, the talking up of the MiG-31s, MiG-31 fighter jets and their supposed crossing of Estonian airspace, the attempt to use the drone incident in the way that it was, Zelensky's increasingly urgent and shrill demands that Donald Trump press forward with sanctions and that the Europeans do so too, without any regard for the effects and consequences upon themselves of doing so. All of that does indeed strongly suggest to me that the Europeans, the Americans, the Ukrainians understand that they are now indeed finally running out of road. And this, therefore, is why all of these plans to seize the assets, the Russian assets, are now being floated in the way that they are. Now, this is, I should say, a point I do want to make, is that obviously there's been discussion about seizing the Russian assets ever since the start of the special military operation. What has changed this time and highlights the degree of desperation and urgency is that up to now, none of the top leaders of Europe, not Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer, not Macron in France, not Olaf Scholz or Friedrich Merz, have actually come out and proposed a plan, a scheme to seize those assets. This is the first time that a key figure, a major figure in Europe, namely European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, has done so. Now, Ursula is not, of course, the leader of a sovereign state, but as President of the European Commission, she acts as if she did. And I think most people who are familiar with the political realities in Europe now would agree that what she says at the present time, at this particular moment in time, incredible though the fact is, carries as much weight as if it was said by the leader of one of the big European countries. So the fact that Ursula is coming up with these plans is a reason to take them seriously. It suggests to me that a critical mass of support for this is now building. There are still doubters. They are to be found, I suspect, in every finance ministry across Europe. The central banks won't like this at all. Euroclear has spoken out repeatedly against every scheme of this kind. Some heads of governments probably don't like this plan. But, as I said, the political momentum is now there to do it, and it is an infallible sign of desperation and at the same time of urgency that they're coming up with it now. The paradox is, Zelensky has just said that he needs $120 billion to get through the next year, 2026. So, assuming that we are really talking about $300 billion in frozen assets, and the value of these assets changes with almost every article. So sometimes it increases and sometimes it falls. I've never been absolutely clear what it is, but I'm going to go with the highest number I have seen, which is 300 billion. Anyway, assuming Zelensky gets $300 billion of frozen assets, and obviously they would be intended for him, what would that do? It would see him through at best another year, perhaps two, but it's not going to solve the underlying problem. He is still going to run out of money eventually, unless, of course, Ukraine goes down, which in that time it might very well do. Anyway, there it is. So I've spoken about the diplomacy. I'm going to say a little bit now about the military situation in Ukraine before turning to other issues briefly, which is briefly the situation with Iran and the snapback sanctions matter. Well, the military trends continue, and all of the indications are that they are intensifying. So we've had further reports this morning that the Russian advance in western Donbass and Pokrovsk region and Zaporozhye continues remorselessly. The Russians, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, have captured another larger, more important, more heavily fortified village in Zaporozhye region called Berezova. They seem to be getting closer and closer to the supply roads, to the town of Gulyapolye, and perhaps to encircling the city of Gulyapolye. And anyway, they continue to push remorselessly westward. They are also now, after a long pause, reactivating their front lines near the village, the big village of Novopavlovka in Dnipropetrovsk region, and they seem to be making the first moves towards storming Novopavlovka, though it's probable that the battle there is still some time from starting. The big news continues to be, as far as I'm concerned, Pokrovsk, Konstantinovka. There is clearly intense fighting going on around Pokrovsk. And the media reports are now saying that some 3 weeks ago, the Ukrainian General Staff advised General Syrsky, who is the overall military commander of Ukraine, that Pokrovsk cannot be held. It can be defended for a time, but it cannot be held. At some point over the next few weeks, it will fall. And that was the advice. Syrsky, according to reports on Ukrainian Telegram channels and those places, apparently was given. Now, of course, one can't be certain that this is true, and it may be that this is untrue, and it may also be that this is disinformation being spread by someone, but it does correspond with what I know about the situation. And yes, the Ukrainians do seem to be still trying to conduct their counterattacks in the area of the Russian breakthrough, northeast of Pokrovsk. Both the Russians and sometimes the Ukrainians refer to this as the Dobropilya direction, by reference to the town of Dobropilya, which lies a little to the west. But they don't seem to be making any progress there. And the reports are now saying that in central Pokrovsk, the Russians have now reached the railway line and the railway station. There's no suggestion that they've yet begun to storm it, but that there is a battle starting for the railway station, and that the supply lines to the Ukrainian grouping in southeastern Pokrovsk are indeed cut, and that the Russians have captured some of the buildings there. Anyway, it is a very complex battle, but I don't think anyone any longer seriously questions the trajectory of travel, the direction in which it is going. There's also been fighting around Konstantinovka, which I'm not going to talk about today. Russians continue to advance. You can summarize it that way. There is also heavy fighting going on in the Siversk area. The Russians apparently are planning, as well as capturing a village called the village of Yampol to the west of Siversk, to capture another village called Dronivka, and to cross the Seversky Donetsk River. In other words, they are working towards an encirclement and the creation of a cauldron of the brave Ukrainian garrison in Siversk. And the Russians also claim that they've been making more advances towards Liman. And the Russians, and I'm taking most of this information now from the Russians, say that there have been Ukrainian counterattacks in the Kupiansk area conducted by the 3rd Azov Brigade, or what was once called the 3rd Azov Brigade. It's been trying to break through the encirclement of the Ukrainian troops inside Kupiansk, and also provide an escape route for Ukrainian troops who are caught in a trap close to Kupiansk on the east bank of the Oskol River. But the Russians say that all of those attacks have been unsuccessful. It's been pointed out that the Russians are now fighting inside a whole series of Ukrainian towns. Pokrovsk, Konstantinovka, Siversk, Kupiansk. And this is unusual. Up to now, over the course of this war, the Russians have tended to focus on one big town or settlement at a time, but this time they are breaking in, and there's street fighting going on in towns right across the contact line, to be more precise, right across the fortified line, the line of cities that the Ukrainians have established. Now, before I continue with the situation in Iran, I do want to say something also very briefly about another area where the United States is active. The United States has just sunk or blown up, perhaps, another speedboat off the coast of Venezuela. There is a huge deployed US fleet off the coast of Venezuela. It's universally assumed that at some point there will be military action taken by the United States government against Venezuela. The military assets that are there in this part of the Caribbean Sea are huge, and I can't see that they have any other purpose than conducting such an attack. There is, I think, a little bafflement as to why it is taking so long. That is the only question that people are asking. Maybe it could be that it is connected with the situation in the Middle East and the plans ultimately may be for an attack on Iran. Now, a couple of programs ago, I expressed my surprise that after having repeatedly said that Iran would no longer cooperate with the IAEA after the IAEA's role, or alleged role, in facilitating the Israeli and American attack on Iran, the Iranians abruptly did an about turn, invited Rafael Grossi, the head of the IAEA, to Iran, had what appeared to be friendly meetings, and apparently with the mediation of Egypt, agreed a way forward towards further cooperation between Iran and the IAEA, which would have allowed the IAEA to conduct at least some inspections of Iranian nuclear facilities. This seemed to be a complete reversal and a massive climb down from Iran, and it surprised me. I think it has become increasingly clear that it was a ploy. The Iranians, undoubtedly now being advised by the other BRICS states, have come to the conclusion that the United States and its Western allies are merely seeking a pretext for an attack on Iran. The refusal to cooperate with the IEA would be such a pretext. The Europeans had brought up this issue of Iran's refusal to cooperate with the IAEA when they moved forward with their assertion that Iran was in violation of the conditions, the terms of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal negotiated back in 2015, and upon which the Europeans said that they would seek a decision from the Security Council in October to snap back the UN sanctions that the UN had imposed on Iran prior to the agreement of the JCPOA. Anyway, what I think happened was that the Iranians realized that the Europeans, the Americans, are determined to find Iran in breach of the JCPOA. They are determined to snap back the sanctions, and that whatever Iran did, it would make no difference. So Iran, in order to cover its positions diplomatically and to ease the problems that its friends might have once the snapback came into effect, agreed to come to this agreement with the IAEA. And notice that Iran did this with the mediation of a fellow BRICS state, which is Egypt. So the Egyptians mediated the agreement between Iran and the IAEA, but the Iranians have made absolutely clear that if the snapback of sanctions is made by the UN in October, then the deal with the IAEA is dead and Iran will not revisit the issue. So what that does is that when the snapback is brought into effect by the Europeans, then Iran's friends and allies, the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, all of them, will be in a stronger position to say that this is an illegal move and they won't recognize it. And that is exactly how it is playing out. Now, after the Iranians came to this agreement with the IAEA, the Europeans, their spokesman here being none other than Emmanuel Macron, said that this changed nothing. The sanctions snapback is now a decided thing. Most extraordinary statement, by the way, and nothing now can change it. The Russians and the Chinese put before the UN Security Council yesterday a resolution which called for an extension, Iran to be granted a further sanctions extension. As I've discussed many times, the Western powers have a structural majority on the UN Security Council, the makeup of which was determined immediately after the Second World War. So it reflects the political geography of that time. And as a result, the resolution that the Russians and the Chinese proposed failed to pass. It didn't gain enough support. Only 4 countries supported it. 9 refused to do so. And that resolution failed. The key thing is that after the resolution failed, the Iranians made a statement repeating again that if there is a snapback of the sanctions in October, Iran will end its cooperation once and for all with the IAEA. The deal brokered by Egypt will no longer apply, and the Russians and the Chinese made public statements that they are not prepared to support the snapback under any circumstances, because they continue to consider that if there is a snapback in October, it is illegal. Now, all of this is very complicated, but it leads us to one inevitable point. In October, the Western powers are going to say that Iran is in violation of the JCPOA and that the sanctions that were imposed upon it are again in effect. The Iranians are going to defy that statement. The Russians, the Chinese will agree with them. There's been apparently a further visit by a top Iranian military official, the chief of the General Staff of Iran, apparently, to Russia. He met apparently people within the Russian energy industry, but I'm sure that a person like that, a military official, will also have met military people in Russia too. Anyway, the point is, it's not that the sanctions are going to be enforced after October, because the Russians and the Chinese have already said that they're going to disregard them. It is that the situation will then have been prepared for a further attack on Iran. And I've just seen reports this morning that the United States has agreed to supply Israel with a further $6 billion of weapons, a huge infusion of weapons. I don't know over what period, but it is difficult to see this as anything other than another statement of US support for Israel, even as the situation in Gaza continues as it is. And as far as I'm concerned, it's another signal, another green light for the forthcoming strike on Iran. So I don't know when this strike will take place. I personally believe it will happen before the end of the year. The Iranians look to me to be preparing for it. The Russians and the Chinese are making their support clear. And, well, we will see where it goes. Now, over the last 24 hours, there's reports that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and the President of China, Xi Jinping, are going to meet, perhaps in South Korea. It's not clear what they're going to discuss. It seems that the dreary story of the TikTok, of the American confiscation of TikTok, has been settled in some form. I'm not going to devote time to discussing that. But anyway, I presume that they will meet fairly soon, and they're going to have an awful lot to talk about. The two leaders, Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, at a personal level, are said to get on quite well. But it seems to me increasingly clear that the general geopolitical picture is becoming fraught and colder. I said a few weeks ago that I was anticipating a stormy autumn, and we can already see the clouds gather. Anyway, that's my program for today. As I said, the next program I will make in London. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember, if you like this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.